everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, North America's leading provider of employee communication resources, including video, websites, e-learning, social media, and virtual events to help you connect with your team. For more information, you can visit us online at projectionsinc.com. I am Jennifer Oraqua, COO of Projections, and your host for today's episode of Project HR. And today we are continuing our Best Practices in Employee Relations series, a series of episodes that features interviews with movers and shakers at companies you know and love to find out how they handle this critical topic. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Cindy Westervelt, Director and Senior Counsel, Employment and Labor, North America for Iron Mountain. This award-winning industry leader in storage and information management services was recently named Google Cloud Technology Partner of the Year for AI and Machine Learning, and in 2020, they won the RE100 Leadership Award for outstanding commitments to clean energy alternatives. Iron Mountain also recently received top marks in the Human Rights Campaign's 2020 Corporate Equality Index for the third year in a row. So, Cindy, clearly Iron Mountain is leading the way in its industry. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, Cindy, first, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your background. How did you find your way to Iron Mountain?
Well, through networking, really. I had actually explored an opportunity with Iron Mountain a year or two before I joined them. And at the time, the role wasn't quite the right fit for me. But I kept in contact with that recruiter. And when a reframed job, the job that I'm in now, the director role, came open again, I called her and we reconnected. And I was delighted that I was offered the job.
Love that. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about Iron Mountain? Clearly, you have a love of the company. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure, I could talk all day about it. We like to say that we are our customers' trusted partners for securing and unlocking the value that they have in their assets, whether that's digital or paper. And we secure those assets through the full life cycle. So we store it. We'll also leverage artificial intelligence solutions to help you understand what's in your data, and then obviously secure it or shred it at the end of its life. I mean, we literally have billions and billions of assets in our care around the world. And some of your listeners may not know some of our unique business lines, like we have an art storage business, and we have an entertainment services business that does work for like the Grammys and the video clips you see there. And we also run data centers around the world.
Very nice. So far in this series, we've spoken with representatives from retail companies. So it's interesting that your career began in retail as well. Does the approach to employee relations change from retail to a more technical industry like what Iron Mountain is in?
Yeah, I think employee relations is largely universal, regardless of what industry you're in general. But I do think the demographics of your employee population does play a part in your ER strategy. So for retail, you typically have younger employees. Maybe it's their first job during college or out of college. And so there tends to be a lot of turnover. It's not a career path. And so you're going to take a different approach with that kind of demographic versus at Iron Mountain, we have a more mature, stable workforce that really look at their jobs as a career. So the issues and the solutions that you have to be tailored to that kind of mindset.
That makes perfect sense. How would you describe Iron Mountain's philosophy on employee relations?
Well, I think that there are two keys to our philosophy, and that's fairness and consistency. I think we strive to make sure that our employees fully understand what is expected of them so that they can make the right choices to advance themselves and thrive, which ultimately will lead to better engagement and better company performance.
Interesting. So what role does Iron Mountain's corporate culture play in that philosophy?
It's really the sort of foundation of the strategy that we have, right? It's the framework. If you don't have a culture that supports what your ER philosophy is, all your ER policies are going to fall flat because there will be no faith in them by the employee base. Our culture really is the foundation for all of the policies that we develop and all the strategies that we employ.
Excellent. All right, Cindy, it's time for us to take a sponsorship break, but when we return, we're going to learn a little bit more about how Iron Mountain approaches employee relations. So stay with us.
Are you working to build an employee relations dream team? I've got an in-depth guide that provides the same roadmap used by employers of choice across the country. It reveals the 3 functional areas you must address before you begin building your dream team, gives you detailed job descriptions, and key performance indicators that will make your team a trusted part of top management. Get inspired and meet the needs of your company with this masterful guide to building your employee relations dream team. Download it at unionproof.com/build an employee relations dream team.
And we're back with Cindy Westervelt, Director and Senior Counsel, Employment and Labor North America for Iron Mountain. So, Cindy, Iron Mountain does have a small number of unionized employees. How does your ER strategy change, if it does, to include those union locations?
Well, I'll tell you, from a big picture, it really doesn't. Because again, going back to the fair and consistency foundation of our strategy, we want to be fair and consistent regardless of whether someone is unionized or non unionized. Our non unionized employees receive the same benefits and policies generally as our unionized ones.
Hmm.
Obviously, there's some tactical aspects that change because, of course, you have to look and refer to the collective bargaining agreement in a unionized setting. And
Sure.
often you have to go through an intermediary, the business agent or the shop steward to make changes or improvements rather than being able to work directly with employees on issues that arise.
Hmm. Hmm. So, in general, what are some employee relations issues that do arise that actually need legal counsel?
Well, I think in the US, investigations into discrimination and harassment allegations usually should have a legal resource assigned to it. Not necessarily to do the investigation, although sometimes for your trickier or high stakes investigations, you probably want a lawyer to do that. But it's helpful to have the lawyer guide the strategy on the investigation along the way. I also think that wage and hour issues are always tricky
Hmm. Hmm.
because sometimes the law in these areas is very counterintuitive to what you think might be the reasonable approach. And the stakes can be pretty high for making relatively small missteps.
Hmm.
And then finally, I think your listeners will appreciate that in the U.S., the leave administration and the patchwork of state and local laws with respect to leaves and time off is getting much more complicated to navigate successfully. And I think that's where legal can help as well.
Hmm. So, how involved does Iron Mountain's legal counsel get into the company's overall employee relations strategy?
Well, I'm lucky, I think, to have great internal partners at Iron Mountain. The HR team is top notch, and we have a really good partnership.
Mm.
So I think I get involved in big initiatives early, and I see them through to the end part, right? So that helps us prevent issues down the road. I've
Mhm.
been working with other clients in my past where sometimes legal comes in at the 11th hour and then there's a lot of rework that needs to be done. There's some
Mm.
kinks along the way, and that's not always the best solution. For smaller issues, those that impact maybe like a small geography or location, I tend to not be involved in those issues.
Yeah, I could definitely second the fact that Iron Mountain's HR team is top notch. We worked with some of those folks, and they are definitely on their game. So, do you think that there's a Goldilocks intersection of legal compliance and employee relations? How much is too little, or is there a point where there's too much legal compliance involved?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's actually one that I struggle with throughout my
Mm.
career to find the magic balance between too much and too little. There
Mhm.
certainly is both extremes. I can see those, right?
Mhm.
Legal cannot drive employee relations strategy. Compliance should not be the number one goal. Employee
Mm.
relations should be about empowering employees and getting them engaged and providing the right environment for people to succeed. And compliance is never going to do that. So that would be too much. Too little is a little bit like the Wild West, and you have inconsistencies there. And that can lead to disengagement, more disgruntled employees, which then obviously leads to more lawsuits.
Certainly, yeah. And from a legal point of view, what role do you think communication plays in employee relations? Letting them know what's going on and why.
I think it's key. I mean, you can't. There are points where you can't tell employees certain things, but to the extent that you can be transparent, I think that helps. That helps employees understand what's going on, even if the message is a difficult one that they don't want to hear. You
Mm.
have an investigation, for example, where you are concluding that there is no wrongdoing happening. The
Mhm.
person complaining may not want to hear that, but it's better to be transparent and explain that to them directly, for example, than to operate in secrecy.
Yeah, certainly. And you said earlier that, sometimes legal is brought in the 11th hour. When should legal really be a part of the employee relations strategy? At what point?
I think the best place for legal to play is in two ways. First, in the beginning, in the table setting of the objective. So if
Mm,
it's a big initiative, it's always better to have legal involved in the beginning. There may not be legal issues there, but it's a good place for your lawyer to start to tell you some of the potholes that could be around, along the road, right?
mhm,
I
mhm,
think the other place for legal to play, and it's a role that I play quite frequently, is just that sounding board. Anytime when you need some another set of eyes on something to give some judgment. Lawyers are good lawyers at least are
mhm.
taught to really think and balance risk and reward, and so they can give you good guidance when you need a second set of eyes.
Sure. So, based on your experience, do you have any advice for our audience on how to avoid things like harassment or discrimination lawsuits? I mean, is it a matter of educating leaders and employees or putting better policies in place? What can we all do to steer clear of these sorts of entanglements?
While I think training is important, and actually legally it's required in many states,
Mhm, mhm.
I actually don't think it's the solution. Because
Okay.
to be honest, many of us take those trainings and it's kind of some can be a check the box exercise unless you
Mhm,
get the right kind of training.
mhm.
I think you need the training to set the groundwork and the framework for what you're doing. But I think to supplement your training, I think it's important that you have a culture that reinforces respect in the workplace and allows speaking up through various avenues so that people feel like they have a place to voice their concerns. And once you get a concern, I think it's really key that the HR team react quickly to any allegation
Mhm, mhm.
because it
Definitely.
helps your complainant to understand you're taking her seriously and
Mhm.
you're moving quickly to nip the problem in the bud.
Along those same lines, we recently discussed conflict management on Project HR. What
Mm.
role does the legal team play in conflict management or even part of the employee relations strategies in conflict management?
Yeah, I mean, I love that series that you did. I would say that, again, it's about bridging the gap between the two parties, right? And making
Mhm.
sure people are heard. I think being the translator in the middle and being able to effectively influence both sides to see the problem from a different perspective can go a long way from making a small problem not blow up into a larger.
Right. Yeah. Makes perfect sense. All right, Cindy, we're going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is Cindy Westervelt, Director and Senior Counsel, Employment and Labor North America for Iron Mountain. And we are back. So, Cindy, pay secrecy is a hot button issue right now. It's one that's been floating around on our blog. We've seen a lot of conversations. It's definitely something that can impact employee relations. So, what can and should employers do with regard to pay secrecy policies?
Well, I think this is going to be a difficult area to navigate for employers, particularly in the U.S. In the coming years. There are a growing number of states that are forcing actually pay transparency,
Hmm.
and I think you're going to see both at the state and federal level an increased focus on pay equity and transparency, as well as boards of directors are getting activist shareholder pressure to be a little bit more transparent about their compensation. So, if you assume that pay secrecy is going away, then what I would suggest that folks do is obviously one adopt a compensation philosophy if you don't already have one, which is then consistently applied throughout your organization, and then consider doing a pay equity audit with your legal department to figure out where you might have some opportunities for fair or equitable pay.
Okay. So, how does Iron Mountain's ER strategy play out with regard to the enforcement of company policies and discipline strategies?
Jennifer, this goes back to something we talked about in the beginning.
Mhm.
For most things, we use progressive discipline. So we're hoping that an employee will understand the expectations and course correct
Sure.
before
Hmm.
we have to move to termination. Again, that idea of let's be fair and transparent and consistent. Here's what you need to do to succeed. However, there are times when we have behavior that undermines our culture or our values, and we take that very seriously. And oftentimes, those instances will result in immediate termination.
Mm. Did COVID-19 impact Iron Mountain's ER strategy at all?
Oh, yeah. I think it impacted all of us. I think moving to remote work had us rethinking how we can keep people connected in a
Hmm.
in a real way. Figuring out how to be flexible and supportive with working parents who suddenly are part-time kindergarten teachers.
Right.
And so we really had to pivot and listen to what our employees were saying they needed in a time of extreme stress.
Hmm.
And as a lawyer, the law was evolving rather quickly around
Hmm.
something none of us had ever seen in our lifetime.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. So do you think that some of those newer policies and things, particularly around remote workers, do you think some of those will stick into the future?
Oh, I do. I do for most companies. I was talking to a colleague the other day, and I just can't imagine people are going to go back to working in the way we were before the pandemic, because I
Hmm.
think this pandemic taught us there's lots of different ways to be productive in the workforce.
Absolutely. So, not every company has the luxury of in-house counsel. Do you have any advice for our listeners at companies that might struggle with knowing the law or knowing how to apply it?
Yeah, well, first, I think there are lots of good free resources out there in newsletters. Big national law firms have lots of free information they put on their websites and articles that can help you keep up to date. So regularly
Hmm.
checking those would be a good idea. And
Sure.
and then the second thing is to tap into a network. I certainly used mine during the pandemic, to see what other companies are doing and to share also what you're doing. I
Hmm.
find the networks that are most valuable to me are the ones where I both give information freely and get information, because then there's a reciprocity there, and people are more willing to share when everybody is sharing what their best practices are.
So, talking about labor and employment law, one of the big buzz things is the PRO Act that's sort of looming.
Huh?
Any thoughts around that, or what your take on that might be?
Well, I'm crossing my fingers that it doesn't pass the Senate.
Hmm.
I think it's going to be a challenge for companies if the bill is passed in its current form. There's a lot about the bill that would be problematic, not just for
Hmm.
unionized work settings, but
Hmm.
non-union work settings as well.
Sure.
M- That said, whether the PRO Act does pass or not and becomes law, I think we will see a move back to the Obama administration philosophy at the NLRB. So
Hmm.
you'll see many of those things which are trying to be codified in the PRO Act
Hmm.
be adopted by the NLRB by regulation.
For sure. And obviously, this is one of the greatest challenges that employee relations professionals are facing right now. Any other challenges that you see going forward?
Again, I think the pay equity and pay fairness is probably going to be something that
Hmm.
Congress takes up. I certainly think it will be a focus for the EEOC. I think a welcome change could be that we could see some federal legislation on leaves and expanding the FMLA. And I know that
Hmm.
sounds a little bit silly for me to be saying that I would welcome that, but I think a federal law would be much better for
Hmm.
employees and employers than having to figure out, California,
Hmm.
Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, etc.
Right. That makes perfect sense, and I know we've discussed that on this podcast previously. That trying to get that consistency of message and the law is very difficult. Do you have any success stories, career success stories that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, what this one predates my Iron Mountain times, but and it's a little bit of an HR success story
Yeah.
more than a legal success story. But there was a situation where I was investigating a fairly sticky harassment and discrimination situation for a client.
Mm.
And what turned out to be is there were two different groups who just simply didn't like each other. So there was a lot of let's see, bending of the truth going on back and forth.
Yeah.
And so the root cause, was really this dysfunction between these two groups. And what was really impressive to see is not only did the HR team just take the findings and sort of put that report to bed. But they really took the time to develop better working protocols, better, clearer policies on where different responsibilities lay between these two groups and within the company. And I
Mm.
think that helped. They took the time to help not only these two groups become more functional together, but also
Mhm.
it helped other parts of the business who had a lot of gray area about who was responsible for what and when people should play in which sandbox.
I love that where a specific incident actually affects the larger approach and the strategy to those employee relations going forward. I think that's definitely a success story.
Exactly, exactly. Me too.
So, Cindy, I want to remind our listeners that links to Iron Mountain and to Cindy's LinkedIn page will be included in this episode's companion guide. So they'll want to be sure to unlock that today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. But right now, Cindy, it's time for our lightning round questions. And these are questions we ask of every guest on the podcast. Are you ready?
I guess so. Go for it.
All right, so our first question is our topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about how companies can foster good employee relationships through positive employee relations. Keeping that positive feeling going, Cindy, which of these songs with the word good in the title would make it onto your work playlist? Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys or I Got You, I Feel Good by James Brown?
Oh, I got to go with the Beach Boys. Good Vibrations.
For sure. All right, next question. What is the best book that you've read recently?
I'm a little late to this game since it's not a new one, but White Fragility.
Okay. And what is your favorite thing about working in employee relations?
It's never dull, and you just can't make up these stories, really, that you hear sometimes.
For sure. Yeah, we've heard a few good ones on this podcast for sure, especially around the FMLA. So what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Well, it's a quote from Wayne Gretzky, the hockey player, and it's, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Mm-hmm. Love that. And finally, who or what inspires you?
I think people who overcome adversity to achieve great things, I have a lot of admiration for, and it really gets me inspired to try new things and reach for something better.
Definitely. Thanks so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR, Cindy.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks too to our listeners. And once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion guide for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR or you know someone who would, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. On Twitter and Facebook, you can find us at Projections, and on LinkedIn at Projections Inc. And last but certainly not least, to make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, I hope you subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or simply give us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's it from me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.